right, let's get started. Just to be respectful of people's time, and it is during the week, and then I guess tomorrow we have our speakers night too. So I may have a couple of new recruits for the club tomorrow, so that'll be cool from Brazil. Anyways, so this is session 3, and we've got one more session after this, and then there's a couple things we can think about doing in the future. But anyways, I wanted to focus this session on lunar photography, including a bit of lunar eclipse photography, and focus mainly on those kinds of things. And the last session will be on deep sky, wide field deep sky photography. So that's a little bit more challenging. So we decided to leave that to the last session. So someone asked me last time, I'm not sure who it was, where my photographs were, and I've sprinkled them throughout the presentation, but I didn't mention them or point them out or anything like that. But so there's a couple of here, which I took several years ago now. They're both lunar photography. One's an eclipse, the other one's just a moonshot at our cottage in Baysville. Fundamentally what that one was is you're quite a bit of distance away, but using a telephoto lens. I was using a 135, stop to S4 and T3I and a Manfrotto, and it's just a 1-second shot at ISO 200. And it was nice because you had some ambient lighting effect, a bit of yellowish and a bit of glow from the lights. So kind of like a foreground object it makes it a little bit interesting. And the other photograph is a lunar eclipse. I think this was 4 or 5 years ago, just entering the penumbra phase. So this was shot at 200 millimeters with a Canon L series lens, T3I f4. And what I did with this one is a technique which we'll talk to tonight, and I know some of you know this already, but it's just bracketing. So bracketing is something that you'll start using for a lot of lunar photography and also solar work, especially solar eclipse photography. Bracketing is very important. This was shot at ISO 400, so a little bit higher speed, and again, Manfrotto mount. Shot between 2 and 5 seconds. And for lunar photography, when you do bracketing, you're going to get entirely different effects depending on the length of the exposure. And I've got some other photographs later on, which we'll talk a bit about that on. Okay, so one thing to note about lunar photography is that there's so many different aspects of it depending on what phase you're shooting on the moon, the position in the sky, the type of equipment you're using. And so if you look at the bottom, there is a graphic there in terms of how large the moon will be with different focal lengths. And this is a good one to, I may send this out to you guys later on, because I use this when I'm planning shots with the moon. It'll give you an idea how large the moon is going to be depending on your focal length, which is kind of handy. So what's deceiving is when you look at the moon with your own eye, it always appears much larger than it does in a photograph, even with telephoto lens. So it's, this the whole thing about the wide field of your eye and how it works depending versus how the lens works. But you can see that depending on what you're shooting and how you're shooting it, and you will want to experiment with different focal lengths for sure. Obviously, if you're going for some specific regions on the moon, you're going to want to have higher resolution and more magnification, and therefore you're going to be going with a longer focal length. The other thing to consider is when you're planning your lunar photography is foreground objects. Now this one here with a plane in front of it, I mean, that's a lucky shot. It's hard to plan for those kinds of things. They just happen, and you have to be available and ready. And I mean, we have somebody in our club named Shaquille, and he seems to catch every possible event that's ever been planned on purpose. I don't know how he does it, but he's very good at it. And Actually could get him on I asked him once if he could get on one of our calls. He was busy, but it would be good for him to go through some of his stuff. His photographs are amazing with that. But okay, this is a bit of a repeat from other sessions, but I wanted to focus on lunar photography when it comes to camera and lens equipment. I say avoid using, so we're not using a full spectrum modified camera. No need for it. In fact, it's a detriment to lunar photography because it messes your colors and things like that. So I would recommend if you're doing primary lunar photography that you do not use a modified camera if you can avoid it. The other thing too is that I talk here about avoiding smartphones, but not really. Some people take very good photographs with smartphones, and smartphones are getting to the point now where they can really record really high resolution. If you have the right brackets that are available for your telescope and you can mount them without vibration, and particularly if you can use an app that's hands-free, you can take some good photographs with a smartphone. I haven't been lucky at it. I really haven't done much in it. So you can ignore my statement there in terms of avoid. I would give it a shot and experiment with it, particularly if you have a good high resolution smartphone. And like I said, people are doing great shots with it. So depending on the phases of the moon, we talked about different phases earlier, you're going to have to look at experimenting with your exposure and doing bracketing. One thing is if you have a DSLR, sorry, and you have a feature called live view, which most have. If you have some of them have the tilt screen, and if you go into live view and you can play around with your exposure settings, you can see what it is what the lighting is going to look like when you photograph, what the exposure is going to be, and experiment with that. And then there's a way of programming the camera such that it'll actually go through a bracketing routine. There is software that you can connect to your camera to allow you to do that, and I think some cameras have menus and setups where you can actually program it in, press a button, stand back, and it'll go through the bracketing. When I'm doing lunar photography, I really like to do bracketing. So I'll go from, depending on the full moon, you're probably shooting at 1/250th to 1/500th of a second because of the brightness, down to when you're looking at a crescent, 1/50th, and sometimes even less. And you need to experiment with that. So the best thing to do is set up your camera so you're doing that bracketing, and hopefully one of the shots will turn out the way you want it to turn out. And it's the same thing that you will do with solar photography as well. And as well, lunar photography, although the exposure lengths are going to be a bit different. And some of the settings are going to be a bit different. We'll get into that later on. You want to focus on the limb of the moon. So if you're taking a photograph of a non-full moon phase, you're going to have some limb of the moon that you can actually focus on, and you're not going to be able to use the Bahtinov mask focusing routine that we talked about earlier on when it came to photographing, deep space and stars and things like that. This is going to be pretty well going on to live view, using maximum magnification on your DSLR and focusing as best you can. And I find that sometimes it's quite difficult to focus on the moon if the atmosphere is unstable. So sometimes you'll get lucky, the little bit of humidity in the air and very stable air. You can get a nice stable image of the moon, and then you can focus very well and get an excellent shot. If it's a cold, crisp night, you may have an issue with the high pressure, and that you'll probably get a lot of shimmering occurring on the moon, very difficult to focus, especially at longer focal lengths. That could also be heat that's reflecting on the ground. So again, location might be important to get out away from objects, buildings, concrete that are actually reflecting heat. And it's the same thing if you're doing planetary photography and other kinds of photography like that, where you're using high magnification and you're going to be impacted by the atmosphere. There is another technique which we hadn't intended to bring up in this course, but I'll just mention it. If you're doing video photography and you're capturing video, and of course, during that video, you'll take, you know, maybe a few thousand frames, and a few of those frames will be quite clear. And in that case, you'll use special software. When it stacks it, it removes the frames that are out of focus or have some atmospheric aberrations, and keep only the good ones and stack those. And you can get some excellent, you know, lunar and planetary photography using that method. It's more involved. There's different software, but in that case, you may not need to worry about your specific location or the conditions of the atmosphere at that time. Also, some people choose to go to higher elevations to photograph moon and the planets. And clearly the reason for that is that the higher elevation you go, the less atmosphere you're photographing through and the crisper the image is. So if you're ever doing some mountain climbing someday, or if you happen to be in Chile or Mauna Kea or something like that, and you get up there and there's a moon out and you get a chance, if you can photograph from there, you're going to get some amazing images. So something to keep in mind if you're you're up in higher elevations. The other thing with lunar photography is obviously you want to be using hands off. So a remote shutter, intervalometer that we talked about before, especially one that if you have bracketing programmed into the intervalometer, that it can actually set up a series of shots that take you through the different exposure settings. With regards to lenses, and in this case, you know, again, I've harped on this a few times, but and this just an example of some lenses. By no means it is an exhaustive list of lenses. I'm sure some of you have excellent lenses, or you know, there's many out there. But one of the things, I mean, the Canon L series lens is a really good lens. I mean, Jake's on the call here now. You could probably talk about some of the lenses he uses, and I'm sure they're excellent. I actually have an ASCAR lens, which is designed for astrophotography. It's FPL 53 Hera glass, and it's really good lens because it's very easy to focus, and it holds the focus. It has locking rings and locking knobs on it, holds the focus, and it's crisp, and it gives sharp images right to the edge, even with a full frame camera, which is really hard to get. And then there's Nikon and Pentax glass. There's all kinds of good lenses that can be used in that family as well. Rokinon is also, I'm hearing, I've never used it, but I know people who have, and they swear by Rokinon for wide field photography. It's relatively inexpensive, but an excellent lens. So something to consider. You know, lunar photography it doesn't have to be in the 200 to 500 millimeter focal length. That's going to give you more detail, but some people like to take photographs across the sky, for example, of different phases of the moon and superimpose them. So they'll take series of shots over a month period or so, and they'll get all the different phases of the moon at different elevations and then put it all together in a sequence. And that you'll probably do with a wide angle lens. So something in the neighborhood of, 35 millimeter or something like that. Any questions on this stuff? I know I covered it fairly quickly, but I know there's lots to consider here, but it's a part of an experiment thing you're going to, get involved in, and that's part of the fun as well.
Dennis, Swapna here.
Yeah.
Great stuff so far. Thank you. Question for you. If I want to mount my Red Cat to the Canon camera, that pretty much acts as the zoom lens, does it not?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's your telephoto, basically. It's just replacing telephoto. A Red Cat 51 is you can treat that like a very high quality telephoto. So yeah.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Dennis, I just wanted to add to the lenses.
Yes.
Sigma now makes some excellent excellent lenses, and they're relatively like less expensive than the original OEM manufacturings. So just to put that out there, consider them because they are really good. There's three different categories of them. Just look for the professional ones, and those are all glass. They're really like made really well, very high quality. Just throwing it out there.
Any model in mind?
There's actually there's one that they have one that's a 50 to 500 millimeter lens, and it's an
Wow.
excellent lens. It's a 6.3 f6.3 to f8. So you're throwing away a bit of your f-stop, but it actually does give you some really good, great results. And for like a fraction of a price of like an L series lens, let's say,
Yeah.
or the Nikon high FE lens glass.
Yeah. No, that's
Just
a good point. That's a good
yeah,
point because you can put a, I mean, their lens can be, is probably going to be the most expensive part of this
right.
particular facet of the hobby. And if you can get excellent lens with, really good quality, that's not expensive. That's the Goldilocks zone if you can do that.
Exactly. Like
I've used Sigma lenses in the past many years ago, and I had some luck, but not a lot, but probably was using the wrong family of
no,
Sigma
actually, like
lenses. I didn't know any better, right? So
in,
that's a really good point.
in the last 10 years, Sigma has become like a premier like they've concentrated solely on lenses now. And
Yeah,
a lot of like other pro photographers that I know of use a lot of their lenses as well, just because they're really good. And again, a little less, more or less expensive than the Canon L series. And
cool.
a lot of the differences in the way the manufacturing of the glass is done, so it's ground really well,
Yeah.
and it's pure glass as opposed to some of the cheaper lenses. Like kit lenses are usually plastic, like you've mentioned it a couple of times. The actual elements themselves are made from plastic as opposed from actual glass.
The impurities in the glass will cause microreflections and refraction
Exactly.
indexes at certain wavelengths differently.
Yeah.
It will impact chromatic aberrations. So you have to have a really good manufacturing process to make sure all the impurities are out there, and that's what makes these dang things so expensive, right? But at
Expensive,
the end of the
exactly.
day, if there's some like that would be a good topic at one point for appropriate or something like that. If people talk about value, right? In terms of lenses and equipment that you don't have to pay an arm and a leg for, but are still really, really good and highly rated. I
Mhm.
would appreciate that. That would be good information for people for sure. Okay, so the mount, keep harping on this. Just I think when you're getting into anything that requires a very high resolution and sharp focus, you can't have any vibrations. You got to really minimize your vibrations. Now you're taking, in some cases, um, fast photographs with exposures in some cases, but in other cases, like lunar eclipses, where you have exposures up to 5 seconds or whatever, you need to have a really solid environment and something that's not going to move on you. So you know, here's a setup here where someone has used a tripod here, but they've used counterweights. Excuse me, a bag in the center, which acts as a like a stability for the tripod, so it doesn't vibrate at all, and it dampens very quickly. The
Mhm.
other thing too is that when you're photographing these kinds of objects, that you'll want to have a timer with a delay for every photo, so that if, for example, there's mirror slap, and we talked a bit about that before, where you can lock up the mirror, some you can't, that you have a couple of seconds for all the vibrations to dampen out before the photograph is taken. Or for example, if you missed your remote, left it somewhere or whatever, program a delay in the photograph. So if you hit the button and there's a small vibration on the mount system and the lens, that will dampen completely out before the photograph is taken. Any questions on that? The other thing too is this head here. I mean, there's many different kinds of heads, but one thing you'll notice that there are some heads with fine adjustments on them. I mentioned this before, where you can move your lens and camera on this mount, but when you lock it down, it doesn't stay centered on the object in the viewfinder. It moves around. Some heads allow you to have a geared manual adjustment on the ball head or the mount that allows you to do some fine adjustments without touching the lens or the camera, and locks in place. Really important for this kind of stuff. It's so frustrating when you're trying to center an object that's under high magnification and you go to lock the camera and the lens down in place with the mount head, and it doesn't stay in place. Something to consider. It'll really avoid a lot of frustrations. Again, focusing, talked a bit about this earlier on, but most DSLRs now have a LCD viewfinder and a minimum 10 times magnification. If you can find a camera that has maybe a higher resolution viewfinder with like a 15 or 20 magnification, again, your sensor is going to have to be able to accommodate that. It can be very helpful when actually magnifying, but when you're going up to 10 times magnification or beyond, and you try to actually go to adjust the focus on your lens, you'll notice that the higher magnification you have, it'll make that image dance around in the viewfinder and can be very difficult. So you have to magnify, wait a few seconds to dampen out, then do it again. It's real trial and error. The better equipment you have, the better mount you have, the better kind of lens with a nice focus ring that's easy to use, it's going to make the job a lot easier at the end of the day. Technique is fairly simple with regards to the moon. You're looking for an area of high contrast where you can really get a sharp object to look at and then do some focusing on there. Again, wait for calm air if possible. If you have to move elevation in terms of getting stable air mass, maybe that's something that needs to be considered. Depends on your environment, your location, or what you're planning for. Then you want to take several test images, and you want to experiment with different exposure settings at the same time as you're taking several test images. Take a look at those images under high magnification and see if their focus is satisfactory. Most of the time, this is a trial and error. It'll take you several times to get the proper focus. And even though if you're focused on one area of the sky, on a different object or whatever, and you swing over to the moon or your different parts of the moon, you probably have to refocus. So every time you're taking a different kind of shot, again, it's to redo the focus procedure. If the temperature changes, so if you're outdoors, say in the fall or winter, and you're doing this, and if the temperature goes down by several degrees, you're probably going to have to refocus again. Why? Because anything that's of metallic metal in your lens system or even in your mounts or whatever, it's going to contract, and it's going to change the focus setting. Any questions there? So I'm not sure who took this photograph. I'm not sure if I did it or someone else did, but I forgot to put the name down. Anyways, this is showing the Terminator and going to a region of high contrast. One of the difficult things to do is shooting a really high resolution full moon, because there's very little contrast and it's really hard to focus. So, again, I would avoid, focusing on an area that's under high illumination. Instead, go for areas under high contrast so you can really pick up those details and focus better. Again, use mirror lockup if your phone or your camera has it. It'll avoid any kind of vibrations. Okay, so back to settings. So the full moon and partial phases. You're going to experiment again with bracketing and exposures, anywhere from 1/50th to 1/500th, depending on, again, the amount of illumination you're dealing with. You know, put a program in, to minimum 2-second delay to dampen out vibrations and use mirror lockup. When it comes to lunar eclipse, it's going to be a little bit different. Focusing is going to be a little bit more difficult. During a total lunar eclipse, or even partial total lunar eclipse, you're dealing with the moon is practically full. And getting the focus is difficult because you do not have the same contrast that you would otherwise have if you're looking at a terminator. So that's going to require same methods, just a little bit more care in terms of focusing on that object. The other thing too is that, as I mentioned before, you're going to take bracketed photographs, anywhere from 1/10 a second up to 20 seconds or more if you have a tracking mount. Anything beyond a few seconds, you're going to need some kind of tracking. If you know, and I would be taking pictures in relatively lower ISO because you want a very wide dynamic range. We talked a bit about this in a previous session, but you can go to high ISOs and deep sky and things like that, maybe 3200, 1600. Personally, I don't advise it. But on things like the moon or the sun, you're probably not going to be using high ISO, not because the exposures are shorter only, it's because you want a really wide dynamic range, and high ISO impacts the dynamic range of the photograph. So in other words, the gradations in color and the image looks more full, in my opinion, when you're using, when you have something that's using the maximum dynamic range that your camera allows you to use. And again, minimizing vibrations. Any questions on these? Okay, so planning your frames. This is probably, once you get a handle on photographing the moon and you're kind of satisfied with your results, maybe you've done some lunar eclipse photography as well. You know how to find and focus, you know about the bracketing and vibrations and all that kind of stuff. Now you start to look at more advanced techniques in terms of planning your frames. Things like foreground objects. There's a couple of examples here where you have some beautiful trees in the foreground. I mean, that is using a telephoto lens, probably in the neighborhood of 500 millimeter telephoto lens, and that tree is way in the distance. But the focus on here is phenomenal. Like, I mean, you really got to get some decent effects in terms of focus. You have to be quite a bit far back, but you can achieve photographs like this. Looking at your location again, planning in advance the location you want to go to, looking at objects such as a barn, trees in a barn or an old farmyard, even from the side of the road. Sometimes you'll be driving down, and I've done this, you're driving down the side of the road and something catches your eye, and you see an old barn that's kind of like on an angle and some nice trees and a clearing in the background. You might think to yourself, hey, come back at nighttime on a full moon. That could be a really neat photograph. And it's sometimes how you find those locations that offer that kind of opportunity. The good thing too is you don't have to be in dark skies, right? You can do this in, this can just be around the corner from you. You don't need Dwardo 1 or 4 skies. You can just hunt around. I mean, we've got a park next to us here, Bronick Park, and it's full of old buildings and things like that. So if you plan accordingly in the right time of year and you're looking at your planetarium software and something's going to come up that's of interest, maybe the moon or even solar photography, might offer a good opportunity for some interesting images in the foreground. Any questions on this?
Nope.
There's Muddy. Okay. All right. And this is the last chart. So it's a short session today, but I like to look at the 4 Ps. of photography and astrophotography. Plan your image. So you're going to plan ahead what it is you're going to be photographing. What are the conditions going to be like at your location? What's the weather going to be like? Are you going to have to contend with objects, clouds? Are there any other interesting objects that you can look in the background or the foreground that could really enhance your image? Again, so that's picking your location that you're going to be photographing in. Then you're going to place your setup properly, whether you need to be up at high elevation or you're going to be on flat ground so that you can align things properly. If you have to polar align, where you're going to have to place your setup to do a proper polar alignment. Sometimes you can't because of there's an object in the way or you're not the right orientation. You may have to move around a bit. And then experiment, have fun, push the boundaries, push your comfort zones, do things. Don't be afraid to make mistakes and do all kinds of interesting things, because that's when the creativity comes up and you end up with some really cool images. So that's today's session. Any questions from anybody? Clear? Okay, one last image here. I put this in here. Jake sent me this. I like this because of it's, there's a few of the P's in here, right? So he's got a great location. So he's picked a nice spot. He's got a beautiful lake in the background here. Some interesting cloud effects. The mounts and the lenses and the cameras are, the kind of things that you need for astrophotography. Good solid mounts, very nice heads on these things, allow full range of motion. And so you set up for an evening of some really interesting astrophotography, and you can get some nice lighting effects off the lake. Some of the if the lake or the location is smooth enough, sometimes late at night, you will get crystal clear lakes that are very smooth. If you're taking Milky Way photography, you could actually photograph a reflection of the Milky Way in the water. And I've done that before, and if you're into the right location and the right conditions, you can get stuff like that. It's really kind of cool. And then this is, sorry.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, like, when you do the lakes, when you want them like glass, and it is, you wind up with like some of the most beautiful images I've ever seen as well.
Yeah,
But
it
not,
really gives you, yeah, I
yeah,
agree, Dave. Something to experiment. Like, I mean, again, you could be walking down a pathway and into an open field, and just, all of a sudden you get this feeling that this would be something special for astrophotography. So you pin it on your Google Maps or something like that, and you hopefully can make use of it later on, right? Never know. This is a photograph of a total lunar eclipse from my backyard. This is several years ago. But the thing I like about lunar eclipses is that you get this very interesting 3D effect that you don't sometimes when you're just photographing the moon. Why? Because you have different illumination across the surface of the moon with different colors. And as well, you have a background of stars potentially, which gives it that standout view. So if you look at this picture, it's kind of like an orange that's hanging off of the background in this 3D effect. This was taken with I think at f5.6 at 8-second exposure at 200 millimeters. So it wasn't even that high a focal length. It was just a camera tripod and a simple photo. But it's the effect that you get when you look for the different phases of the lunar eclipse and the kind of lighting and the colors that you get across the surface. Okay, that's tonight's session. Thanks everybody for attending. If there's any questions from anybody? Yeah.
Yeah, I had one.
Yes.
Could you go back to the concept of bracketing for me? Basically, could you just review that one more time? Thank
So, yeah. So with regards to bracketing, what you're doing is you're taking a series of photographs with different exposures under the same conditions. So,
Got it. Okay.
right, so, for example, if you wanted to, bring out moonshine, during, you know, certain phases of the moon, you want to have a little bit more moonshine, you might want to consider taking bracketed photographs and increasing the exposure so that you get more light coming in. Another example would be under a total solar eclipse, such as we just had. You bracket your photograph so you get the inner corona, the mid corona, and the outer corona. And so by taking different exposures, you're going to get different effects.
Okay, thanks, Dennis. Got it.
You're welcome. Okay. Any other questions? All right. Thanks everybody for attending. I appreciate it. And we'll get this up. And so you can review it, and for those who weren't able to attend. And next week, May 2nd, will be the last session. And then one of the things I'm toying around with, it depends on timing, is maybe having a workshop, an evening workshop where you can bring out your equipment and gear and we can practice out in the field somewhere under dark skies. That's it. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Dennis.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
thanks,
Take care.
Dennis.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.